Good evening, everybody. It's a delight to be here to initiate this series. I hope will be a long-running series of lectures for the English-Speaking Union in collaboration with the British Council. To do the first one is a privilege indeed. And it is indeed, as some of you already said, about global English. And you know, in the last 10 years, things have changed so dramatically in that respect. 10 years ago, it was easy giving a lecture on global English. I used to do it quite a lot. Because what everybody wanted to know 10 years ago, they were really quite simple questions. Questions like, well, how many people speak English around the world? The answer to that is obvious. Nobody knows. And so one kept answering that in that way for several years running until the statistics gradually grew and grew and grew. Now I think we do know. Nobody, of course, trusts statistics at all. But insofar as the estimates from many different sources are now coinciding, it does seem to be the case that there are about 2 billion people, that is 2,000 million, speaking English around the world. And of those, we estimate that somewhere in the region of 400 million are native speakers of English from Britain, Ireland, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the countries of the Caribbean, and a sprinkling of other territories. Which means, of course, that for every one native speaker, there are 5 non-native speakers of English, and that is the statistic which, of course, warrants the second question that was very frequent 10 years ago. What is happening to English as it becomes global? Nobody knew because there were no precedents. There has never been a global language before, genuinely global in the way English has become. What everybody noticed was the arrival of what were called in those days, and still are, new Englishes. New Englishes are those varieties of English that have grown up in countries that have taken on English as either a first language or a second language or a foreign language. And the principle was very clear. As these countries adopted English, they then adapted it. And it didn't take long for that adaptation to take place. And as a result, the notion of English as a single, homogeneous, standardized variety that everybody speaks in the same way the world over rapidly began to dissipate. What we noticed more than anything else was that these new varieties of English were rapidly becoming distinctive in vocabulary, in grammar, in pronunciation, even in spelling and punctuation to some extent. And as a result, the concept of English as an amalgam of varieties of the language, or different international dialects, if you will, became the dominant theme in the first decade of this century. So the two main forces that drive language along, that always drive language, the need for intelligibility on the one hand and the need for identity on the other, they have come together in this concept of global English. An international notion of standard global English is there because we all need to understand each other. That's the intelligibility criterion. And that was the dominant discussion point in the 1990s and the early 2000s. In the past 10 years, and the focus of me this evening, is to look at the way in which identity has grown and grown and grown. We're past the stage now of noticing that these varieties are distinctive in their various ways. The question now is, what happens when you develop distinctiveness of that kind? It is an appropriate month to be talking about identity because, as you know, probably later in the month, the end of the month, we have Mother Tongue Day, UNESCO's Mother Tongue Day, which is a celebration of the fact of linguistic diversity the world over. Well, all right, linguistic diversity in the sense of 6,000 or so languages, but the other side of the coin is, of course, dialect diversity in the sense of who knows how many international dialects of English there are now. Now, it is this latter point, the identity point, that is growing and growing and growing. As people explore the implications, what happens when you get these different identities manifesting themselves in their various countries? Of course, the phenomenon of local identity at an international level isn't new. After all, we have long recognized the contrast between British English on the one hand and American English on the other. That's over 200 years old. And we're familiar with the immediate cultural implications of that. People talk about, you know, two countries divided by a common language. You know, that kind of comment has been made frequently over the years. And it only takes a few moments of contact with the cultures of these two main English-speaking domains to see what the cultural clash is, or put it another way, to see what the lack of understanding is, the clash of the notion of unintelligibility. We only have to listen to a cricket commentary on the one hand and a baseball commentary on the other for the world to divide into two groups, one of which understands the first and not the second. Brown was hit in the helmet, or perhaps I should say Brown was hit in the helmet by a Jim Taylor pitch in the top of the 8th inning and was down at home plate for 3 minutes. I haven't the foggiest idea what that's all about. On the other hand, my American friends tell me that Hussain has placed 2 slips and a gully and a Blackwood short leg for the occasional ball zipping in off the seam is equally unintelligible. Actually, I'm not sure I understand that either, but you see my point. When you look especially at the language of sport, you see these two varieties differentiating quite dramatically. And of course, sport distinctiveness is not restricted to British and American English. As anybody knows who reads, for example, the Daily Yomiuri in Japan, where sumo wrestling has its own highly distinctive vocabulary, which is opaque to many of us. Now, there isn't anything new, as I say here, in the fact that we have two varieties that can at times, through their cultural background, become so difficult to, as it were, translate between. It is something I remember very well, though, learning to appreciate myself. My very first visit to America, way back in the 1960s, I was totally confused by American English. I did not know what to expect at all. I remember coming downstairs once from where I was staying into a diner, and stood in a queue, in a line for my breakfast. And as I came towards the place where the man was serving things, I saw what he had, and I said, I'd like some eggs, please. And he turns to me and says, how do you like your eggs? I had never been asked that question before. It wasn't a British question in those days. How do you like your eggs? I had no idea what he meant. And I stammered and said, cooked? And he looked at me as if I was foreign and said, hey, buddy, do you want them once over lightly, sunny side up? And he rattled off a whole host of idioms, which I now know the meaning of course. You know, in the last 30, 40 years, we've become familiar with this kind of vocabulary. But at the time, I did not know it. And this was the kind of cultural clash that I was unprepared for. I still have trouble these days in America understanding the vocabulary of sandwiches. You probably have had the same kind of experience. Now, it doesn't take much to develop a sense of the complexity of the cultural notions that we're talking about here this evening. The definition of culture I'm using is very, very broad. I include local plants and animals, for example, food and drink, as I've already mentioned, customs and practices, politics, religion, sports, games, myths and legends. You think of all the areas that produce the identity that belongs to a place, and you're in the domain of what I'm calling culture this evening. And the argument I want to make and want to illustrate, because this evening is little more than a string of stories to illustrate the point, is that most of these aspects of culture do not travel. I mean, some of them do. Shakespeare does, for example. I spent quite a lot of time a few years ago collecting all the instances of to be or not to be around the different English-speaking areas of the world. I don't mean that to be or not to be, that is the question, was being used literally as part of the Hamlet play. No, what I mean was it was being adapted for some magazine or newspaper or periodical of some kind. And you had examples like headlines in newspapers, to pay or not to pay. That is the question. Now, what the people were paying for doesn't really matter. The point is the headline was like that. Or to drive or not to drive, to diet or not to diet, to fight or not to fight. That one I remember just before the Iraq War a few years ago. The newspapers pick on these things and use them. Those examples are from India and Australia, and I forget where the third one was from, Singapore, I think. But anyway, the point is that's something that travels. People assume a knowledge of Shakespeare, or at least that particular aspect of Shakespeare, and assume that their readership is going to recognize it. And that you will find dozens of examples of as you go around the world.